I'm just going to leave it in this mode because it seems my slide is not coming up. So while we meet virtually, let us begin by acknowledging the ancestral territories of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples from coast to coast to coast upon which we meet today. We acknowledge the need to work collectively and individually to recognize the past and continued effects of colonialism, racism on Indigenous families, communities, and knowledge systems through the Indian Act, Indian residential schools, Indian hospitals, and other systemically discriminating policies and practices. We affirm our responsibility as settlers to improve relationships between nations and actively seek greater understanding of Indigenous peoples and cultures in the communities in which we live, work, and play. Please join us in this acknowledgement and commitment, each in our own way, and through Team Primary Care, to move forward through truth and reconciliation. And folks can tell us where they're coming to us from. Thank you, Doug, for letting us know. So welcome, everybody, and we're so pleased that you're joining us today. Just a little bit of a background. This is one in a series of webinars, and we've had maybe 5, 6, or 7 so far as part of Team Primary Care. And to date, we've covered what kind of services do we provide in primary care, how do we apply an interprofessional competency framework and how we learn together, and then how do we talk about leadership and power dynamics within an interprofessional team, and then addressing overlapping scopes of practice and negotiating roles. That was our last webinar. So I'm pleased to say that our next one is pulling that together. And so now we know, where we've discussed some of these various pieces in terms of working together collaboratively in primary care, what do we need to do in terms of operationalizing that? What are the organizational culture and change management pieces that we need to think about, both in the context of our practice, but also this revolutionary thing that we're trying to do as part of Team Primary Care, and move the needle in terms of the way in which people are trained in primary care and aligning the way in which we're trained. So I'm pleased to introduce Sasha Karakusevic, who is part of the National Health System in the UK Horizon team. And that's a specialist team within the Transformation Directorate in the NHS. And it focuses on supporting large-scale change in health and care systems. Sasha started his career in dentistry and maxillofacial surgery. He then became interested in how health systems work and changed his focus to the management and delivery of care. Before joining Horizons team, he spent 20 years in executive director roles and leading the development of an integrated care system in South Devon. So Sasha, over to you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dale, and good afternoon to you all. It's a pleasure to be talking, and I hope it's a worthwhile use of your lunch times. And in preparing for today, Dale said, well, let's make it personal. So I'm also going to introduce Dr. Ben Allen, and Ben is a GP in Sheffield, and you'll hear a little bit more about a change program that he's been involved in a moment. And just to add to what Dale was saying, by way of my background, I married into general practice. So my wife has been a GP for many years, just recently retired. So vicariously understand quite a bit about primary care and how that fits into the system. And I guess just to say, thinking about primary care, it's a very unique space, and things that work in hospitals don't necessarily work in primary care, but some of the general principles for change I think are useful and applicable in local settings. So hopefully we will have a chance to explore those. Do add any questions into chat. We'll keep an eye on anything that you would like to clarify, and I hope you get some value from what we've got to say. Let me just share my screen, and we can get going. Has that worked across the Atlantic? Fantastic. So encouraging improvement, organisational culture and change management. What can we say about this? Well, Helen Bevan, several of you I know Helen. She's done quite a bit of work in Canada and is prolific on what we used to call Twitter and now call X, or try to call X. And recently she tweeted this tweet about systematic improvement work, and Helen and I have been talking with Ben recently, and the work that fabulous work that he's been doing in Sheffield. So when we were preparing this session, I thought, well, why not make it real and give Ben a chance to explain some of the change that he's doing in his practice, and see how that helps you with what you're doing. So welcome, Ben. Thanks for joining. And
very welcome.
Your tweet gives a hint of some of the work that you did, but would you like to tell a little bit of a story about the project that you started?
Sure. Yeah.
I'll stop sharing for a moment so people can see you.
Oh, yeah, that's better. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm a GP, primary care doctor. So I'm a partner. So in England, we kind of own the business, a few of the partners, and so I started here about 5 or 6 years ago. And can everyone hear me? Okay, by the way. Yep. Yeah. And it was very busy. Everyone was very overworked, overwhelmed, and I got the sense that the narrative really was that this is just what general practice is like, that the funding has not increased at the rate that it should have done for the challenges, for the way that the complexity and has increased over time, and it's just something that we have to accept, that this is what it's like. And I didn't buy that explanation, because I could just see opportunities everywhere where there was opportunities for improvement. And so initially, I felt like some of the kind of core motivations really was that I felt that it wasn't a great place to work for the staff. And as an employer, I thought I don't feel comfortable actually with what this is like, the experience for the staff. And of course, everyone will hopefully understand that the way you get great care is you expect and trust that the staff want to do their best. And so if you can help them to thrive, then the patient care will flow from that, which is very much what's ended up happening. So the patient satisfaction was quite low, given we had some really brilliant clinicians as well. That was the other thing that didn't add up. We were excellent clinicians, but we were quite low down in patient satisfaction. But I could feel the seeds opportunities to improve. So my no training in change management. So I started to I noticed the symptoms, some of the processes, some of the individual dynamics, and I tried and kind of improve those just intuitively, and felt like it wasn't really making much inroads. And so that's the point where I took a step back and started reading. So I just got books basically off Amazon, started reading. So people like Patrick Lencioni, one of my favorite, Jim Collins, Simon Sinek, Brené Brown, Nancy Klein, among others. And I was reading these books, and I would read it and be like, yes, I can see there's some really key things to sorting out the roots of the cultural problems. And I'd read more, and eventually the books the topics would overlap. I'd start to see how they fit together, started to create a bit of a framework, and then thought, okay, and then build almost a bit of an order of how we're going to make some improvements. So I'll just kind of give the 4 kind of broad areas that are all slightly distinct. So one was lifted from Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team, and that was about team dynamics. And that so the very base of that pyramid is building psychological safety, building trust, and that comes across in loads of work. And that was that kind of that pragmatic way of. And it doesn't feel like work often, but it's around getting people together, helping them to stretch their vulnerability, any exercise that means that people start sharing a bit about themselves, a bit about their challenges, a bit about their weaknesses, modeling it. And as you do that, then you're able to when you have challenges, you're able to have real debate. People are more likely to speak. You facilitate meetings such that it makes it safer for people to contribute in smaller groups, perhaps. And then when you do that, you're more likely to get the buy-in to whatever decision gets made, and be more likely to get that follow through. And also that was the that was almost like the framework and relational mechanism for making all the other changes, because obviously this is about how you do process of change. So the other thing was around building and releasing potential of individuals. So that starts with recruitment. And I think probably if there's any one thing that we've done brilliantly, and it's recruitment. And I just think you can't spend too long on recruitment, because you think about the difference that someone who's brilliant makes, who's a really good fit, kind of as in terms of who they are as a person, their values, what they care about, their strengths. If you can get that right, the difference that makes over the period of time that they're here with us, you know, financially and in terms of time, you couldn't spend that long on recruitment. So getting the right people, it makes a really big difference. And my light's just gone off. Then it's about, for the people that are actually here, it's about how do you bring out the best in those people? And we had there was a narrative that we care about people, we want to be a family, but actually that wasn't people's experience. And we had, at that point, we had a manager looking after kind of 30 staff really, and there wasn't really a very good, and there was a little bit of some leadership structures, but the people who were leaders were people who just been around the longest and weren't necessarily they didn't really necessarily, their drive wasn't bringing out the best in people. They were just the most clinically senior. So we had quite a tricky process. That was one of the most difficult things, was trying to get the right people who people trust, who people admire, who people respect, the people who everyone goes to already, trying to get that leadership aligned, because kind of get the natural leadership aligned with the official leadership. And that again made a massive difference, is getting the right people leading teams. And that's then your mechanism of bringing out the best in people, because you've got someone whose job it is to get to know those people from, you know, personally, what's going on in their life, what their struggles, what their gifts, what are they good at, what do they want to grow in. Having day-to-day conversations, not just a big appraisal once a year, but that appraisal is really important to do well as well. Helping them to know the expectations, having difficult conversations. That's another really big one, I think, is around Jim Collins' phrase of getting the right people on the bus, recruitment, getting the wrong people off the bus, which I think is more around making sure you have proper conversations when people aren't performing. Normally, they don't have to get off the bus. It's normally about helping them to just addressing when things are not going well and doing that sensitively and properly, and getting everyone in the right seats, which I think is around leadership. So another big thing that I've not done so well here so far, but I think it maybe is more important at bigger organizations. I think we've done this subtly, but it's just around being purpose-driven organization. It's kind of having those questions of what are we actually coming to work for, what are we here for, what do we want to achieve. So we've done a big piece on our values because we want to embed the values, but also I think we need to do a piece around what are we trying to achieve, what does good look like, and then say, okay, how are we doing at that, and what we're going to do now to get there. And the other thing is around communication. This is the fourth one. Just communication just comes up all the time, doesn't it? So I think about the communication between staff, between the leaders, and between patients, and in all directions. So with patients, we've done a lot of we've kind of increased access, online access, so people have got an opportunity to be able to write more rather than having to go through receptionists. So 70% of our work comes in online now. So we've also trained the receptionists to give really good information, so that really helps us. But we've also communicated back to them. So we've set Facebook. I put out videos, trying to help them to understand what changes are going on. We ask them their opinions, getting feedback from them. And there's often kind of quite a good dialogue. And I think that helps patients feel included. They understand things more. It's that communication. And then communication between staff and leaders. So I did a poll around what's the best way for us to communicate with you guys in terms of like, notice boards, WhatsApp, emails. We had we basically everyone just ranked an email and WhatsApp were the top two for everybody. And so I think that's really helped. And the meetings, we don't use meetings to just give information out, because you can give information out in another way. You can present it by email and send it. The time that precious, because it's so busy, that precious time when you make the time to get together, that's when you discuss, you talk, you build relationships, you have dialogue, you don't waste time giving out notices at that point. So there are probably four main things, so I'll stop there. So team dynamics from Patrick Lencioni, finding and building potential and releasing potential in staff, being purpose driven, and dealing with communication.
Really helpful, Ben, and I think lots of points appearing in chat around recruitment. You shared some of the results that you achieved, and I'll just share the headlines. And I think what struck me when I first saw these was what you're describing is a lot of good management, and you can see that something interesting is happening here relative to the national position. So I don't know what tell us a little bit about those bar charts and your experience.
Well, this was lovely to see this, to be honest, because we're not a very data-driven practice. It's not something that people are motivated by, really. And what was really interesting was that I was trying to support us to deal with the cultural underlying root. It's a little bit like, when you've got a kind of a garden or something, it's like focusing on the soil, maybe focusing on the quality of the plant. You're not looking at the fruit, you're looking at the culture, you're looking at what is a healthy environment. And so we weren't trying to produce a lot of results, really. It just felt like the right way to run an organization. And it's so interesting to then this kind of national survey that gets posted out to, like, I don't know, it's about 1% of the population. And they're asking all these people about the fruit of what's the results of the surgery that they're working for. That they go to, and it was a real surprise to see that actually dealing with things like recruiting a great manager. How long did it take before they then they improve the shape of the team, and that starts to improve the patient experience. And patients who only come on average maybe 3 to 5 times a year, they start to get such a different experience. They start to answer the survey differently. So it's amazing to see this, because this wasn't our motivation, getting good data on here, but it's really lovely to see it being expressed kind of across the board. A really amazing one was continuity. I mean, continuity just makes sense. We've not had a big drive around continuity particularly. We've just done a drive around doing the best we can for patients, and obviously trying to match patients with the right with the right staff. But ours has gone in massively the opposite direction to the national picture. So that's really satisfying to see.
You also shared, I'm just getting this to move as well. You also shared some patient feedback, and I love the use of what 3 words. Do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, so this was done quite a long time ago now. 4th of Feb. This could have been 18 months ago. So I just put online. I was thinking about getting some learning about some of the things that we could change, but it was just universally positive, and just so amazing to have social media where people are often quite scared to engage. I think we had a real problem with access early on, and people were quite angry about how hard it was to get an appointment. So I wouldn't have thought it would have been that useful to have then gone out at that stage when we know so clearly what most people's concern is. So once we dealt with that, and people were generally in a happier place. But yeah, lovely to see all that this is how things are perceived. It's great.
And just finally, Ben, at this stage, you're describing it. You're making it feel like quite a breeze. Was it as easy as you're describing? How did it feel to lead this work?
No. Well, interestingly, right, really early on, I had no connections with anyone else who thinks this way. I'd read books. I wasn't connected on Twitter with anybody, because I do quite a lot of stuff on Twitter now. And since all this has unfolded, I've been able to connect with like-minded people. But I was totally on my own. So I was reading these books, and I was kind of sharing with the people here about what I thought needed to change and how. And people, no one really. There was very few people who thought, yeah, this is worth it. And I used to go back home, and I'd be telling my family about the things that were happening and the challenges, and even my wife said, and one of the things I was said was, you can't fix this. It's not fixable. And even my wife was saying, I think you can't. I don't think this is doable. So there was a point where there was only 1 or 2 people who really thought. It was particularly the reception team was really struggling relationally and culturally, and been like a decade, of politics and put very low morale, very high turnover. But it was this conviction. Once I could see that there was actual things, and I could see that these were the answers to the problems that we had, even if other people couldn't see that at the time. And I felt like I do believe that if we can make these things change, it will make a difference. And it's a small enough organization that I can probably pull things through it. There'll be very different skills involved in rolling this out nationally or working with a massively bigger organization. So but yeah, there was a good, and the results are so far down the line as well. Grafting when the problem is that when you're in an organization that's overwhelmed and quite dysfunctional, really, because that's what happens when you get an overwhelmed organization. How do you find the time to actually make the changes that start to steer things in a different direction? And the things that really make a difference, that are deep cultural things, they're hard work, and they won't even give you some kind of immediate benefit. I mean, the benefit might not be a year or two down the line. So it is hard to have the conviction and the work to do that. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, and let's go behind the story, and we'll come back and have a look at the chat. The chat's just updated lots of really helpful points for you to have a look at. So Ben's told us a story about change, and I thought this would be quite a good point to build on. So first to share this of the original triple aim and the quadruple aim, or even quintuple aim that we're now talking about in terms of how do we improve care. And we know this, and my colleague John Bryant recently shared this slide in this form, where there's only two things that anyone needs to focus on to deliver everything else: enhancing the experience of care and increasing well-being and engagement of the workforce. And I think, Ben's just talked about that really, really clearly, hasn't he, in terms of both the need to do both, but also the balance between them. And one of the first things that people said to me in terms of creating change was, what are we here for doing? If you're not clear about what you're here for doing, then doing things is a bit tricky. And just to spend that time and re-emphasize the point that Ben was making about purpose. So enhancing the experience of care and increasing well-being. Now, what's sometimes quite interesting is in a professional team, people have different views about what the answers are to those things. And it's important to create the time to do things about that. So just to remind you about the trans-theoretical model for change. And usually by the time that we're ready to do a project like Ben's just been talking about, we're in the action stage, or we're right down battening up the hatches in the maintenance stage. So when you start to do a change, you might think there's a need for change, but a lot of other people won't. Some people won't recognize the need at all. They'll be pre-contemplative. Some people might be thinking about it, and some people might be preparing. And the challenge is, if you go straight into action, you're going to create a top-down, I'm in charge, you're going to follow model. Lots of evidence suggests that's not a good way to progress. So what can we do instead? First thing is to think about complexity. I know from what Dale said, you've already done some work on this, but just to mention the Stacey diagram, I find this really, really helpful. And what you've got here are two axes. One, the degree of certainty about what to do, and the other, the degree of agreement. And if you've got high certainty and high agreement, you'll be in the bottom left-hand corner, which says just do it. And I didn't hear much of that in what Ben was saying. I heard actually there wasn't a high level of agreement, and actually there wasn't a lot of certainty. And what that says is there's a need for innovation and complex change. And Ben described really clearly how he did this. It's quite a good exercise if you were just starting something off, just to see where people are and get them to put dots on a chart like this. Quite often the people who think they've already got it cracked are a long way away from where the rest of the group are. So if in doubt, plot the dots and see what emerges. And Stacey's model sits very closely with the Cynefin framework, which Dave Snowden created. And the interesting thing here is to have a look at the blue text in each of the quarters. And what happens in a chaotic sense is the management response is act, sense, and respond. And you could hear that in what Ben was saying. He started to do something, he made sense of what was going on, and then was quite thoughtful in how to move that forward. Quite often you'll find yourself in a complex situation where doing some probing to find out what makes sense before responding makes sense. And very rarely are most of the problems you're going to be dealing with in the obvious category where you can just say it's one of these and go off and do it. So that difference between our day-to-day clinical experience of pattern recognition, it's a cold, it's a whatever, fix it. Actually, it's a different type of problem solving. And I would say if you're changing organizations and being deliberate about developing culture, being clear about the sorts of problems and how to respond is useful. What sort of energy, therefore, do you need to do it? Well, this is probably an example not to follow. And what we do, and I guess you're already doing in this collaboration, is how do you build the relationships and the networks? Very rarely is there a single expert in the room, and quite often, and we'll come back to this in terms of power, it's very easy for people to assume that the person standing up has got the power and they should either just listen or go to sleep. So how do we create the kind of purposeful conversations that are going on the other side of the slide? Which takes us to thinking about Donella Meadows. I don't know if you've come across Donella Meadows, but about 20 years ago, she wrote this paper on leverage points. And the interesting thing about leverage points is the further away from the pivot are the things that make the biggest difference in change. And you'll see number one is seeing the world in a different way, the power to see a paradigm as such. Number two is a mindset or a paradigm shift, and down at the other end is just measuring what's going on. And what's really interesting, again, I think in what Ben was talking about was it doesn't have to be like this. We could change what we do. So recognizing the difference then requires change in the social system and the structure to get change to happen. What I use this for is quite often if you're looking at a board agenda or a meeting, what's on the agenda, you'll find loads of things that are somewhere between 7 and 12 on the Donella Meadows screen, and those will typically take 3/4 of the meeting to sort. What you then find is there's no time to talk about the important stuff. And so as you're preparing to do change, think about how you're going to create the conditions and what kind of social system and structure is needed to do that. I'm going to give you a few hints as to what the answer might be, or some answers. But again, I find this a really helpful model. Takes us to some things about not to do, and Mark Jabban's another clinician who got fascinated about change, and his research in looking at the neuroscience of how people work is don't go down this line on the left-hand side of find an issue. So Ben could have said, well, we've just got to sort out access. He could have sat in his surgery coming up with what the options are, what the choices should be, and then gone off and told everybody what to do. Well, I didn't hear any of that in the story. Ben went down the right-hand side of, okay, we've got an issue. How can we start to create a shared outcome work through the choices. And what tends to happen in that situation is people are buying in, rather not that they're not buying in, they're becoming invested in the solution. They own what is being created. And we find that to be a really helpful approach. But what we're doing here is changing the power balance and recognizing a different approach to leading. So I'll say a little bit more about that.
Sasha, should I just give an example actually of that one? We'll just go back a sec. There's just a really lovely example that happened recently. So lots of the people were going to our managers saying they were concerned about their weight and they felt overweight and it's getting them down. and one of the receptionists had gone to Slimming World. This was this kind of like commercial way of being able to lose weight. And and he was like, well, maybe we could fund this as a practice of people to be able to go. And the other receptionists couldn't afford to go, so could we just fund it? And I was like, well, that's potentially a good idea, but wouldn't it be interesting? We're kind of jumping to that as a solution. Like, why don't we have a meeting with everyone at lunchtime and let's talk about health? And this is again an example of building psychological safety, because actually it's a bit difficult to do, but if you pull it off, then you've created more closeness and vulnerability with each other. So we talked about our health. What are the things we're happy about? What are things that are concerning us? What are things we want to? And people went into small groups and fed back. These are the things that are with, you know, don't feel great about. And then we had another round where we talked about what are some of the solutions to these problems that people have put up. So, you know, one of the main things was around time to make good food, time to exercise, and that kind of thing. And then the solutions that came up, there was loads of solutions, and then we got people to put their hand up for for 3 or 4 of the things that they most resonated with as potential solutions that we could do as an organization. So we took out the ones that this is for your home life. What as an organization can we do to support you to be more healthy? And people put their hands up, and then we ended up with like a top 3 or 4 things that we could do. And one of them was well, there's 2 actually that were interesting. So one was around, could we have like a weighing club where we all bring a pound in and we get weighed, and then we, you know, it's a bit of motivation, and then we go on a night out when we, you know, spend the money at the end. And it was, and the other one was around bringing food in. So one thing was we don't have time to prepare good food. So let's step a WhatsApp group for anyone who wants to, and then if you want to, then you can be a part of this lunch club where we take it in turns making high quality, good, fresh food, and we bring it in and we share it all out. And so interestingly, the reason that the Slimming World works is it's about community. It's about the fact you're not doing this on your own. You've got other people around who are also in it. And so we ended up coming up with our own idea that was about people in the organization either losing weight together or eating good food together. And so we've now set up that. And so this example of how we could have come up with an idea that could have worked okay, but actually we've co-created, and everyone was then bought into that. And so the lunch club is every Friday now. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And it's what a great thing to be able to do as a group, you know, to be able to share food together at lunchtime and chat, and yeah. It
creates time as well, doesn't it? That's a lovely example, Ben. Let's carry on the story. And we also find the model for large-scale change really helpful. And this was developed by the NHS to think about large-scale change, but it works in lots of different settings. And I think just to emphasize the importance of the framing process, and the story that Ben's just told fits here quite nicely with frame the issue, think about who to engage, make lots of changes, see what happens, get more people involved before you start to settle on a solution. I think that the key point here is it's really hard to predict. So if somebody says, well, you need to write a business case and tell us what's going to happen in 2 years before you can start doing anything, you know you're on the wrong track. Nobody will know what's happening in 2 years. The key is to start and to do the framing and to come up with the solutions. And again, you can save a lot of time by getting people involved in a systematic way. So I've put the reference on there if you want to look at the whole of the resource, but that's the key model to keep in mind.
Sasha, just at the time check, you've got about 20 minutes. I know you can't see your screen, so just wanted to let you know.
Yeah, no, we're doing absolutely fine on time. Thank you, Dale. And just to think about boundaries, and you can oversimplify, and what we would say is be really cautious about putting the boxes where you want them to be without understanding the soup around them. That's particularly true in a multidisciplinary, complex environment. So it's not as simple as just putting a boundary around it and getting on. It's about thinking through who those relationships are with, what's going to influence what's happening in the box. So just be cautious is the message there. And Mary Albin's work on adaptive space is really helpful here. And again, Ben's stories illustrated this. Yeah, actually, creating that lunchtime space, as well as sorting out food, is bringing operational people together in a place where it's possible to talk about improvement, it's possible to build relationships and do things differently. So how do you create time in a really, really busy environment is perhaps one of the first questions to mull over. As I've mentioned earlier on, this is about a shift of power, and you may have come across Jeremy Hyman's and Henry Tim's work on new power and old power. If not, it's well worth having a look at. And the argument is old power is like a currency. It's held by a few people. It's pushed down. So Ben's decided what the menu's going to be, and it's set out at 12 o'clock, and you'll come through in a specific order, and it sort of becomes very transactional compared to the new power approach that Ben talked about, which is lots of people being involved, shared, open approach, and very relational. And what tends to happen is in an old power world, you create resistance that stops or slows movement. In a new power world, you tend to manage that because people are negotiating and finding a common way forward. So if you find that you are in an old power world, you'll find that you're seeking to plan and to manage what's happening. You're seeking to overcome forces of resistance, and you're seeking to be very diagnostic and to manage the resistors. And have you been part of a change process that feels like that? I'm sure we all have. And what we find is that it creates more and more tension, it creates more and more polarization, and at a time of uncertainty, it actually slows down progress. So in a new power world, what we're trying to deal with is how to deal with emergence, how to build on these connections and interactions to create a learning environment and to chew the cud, to continue the lunchtime theme of this talk. So recognize those conditions and think about the situation that you're either in, or more importantly, as a leader, you're creating. Can you access new power approaches to get your team involved in the work that needs to be done? A good reminder here that if you are seeing resistance, it's probably because, going back to the trans-theoretical model, you've dived into action. Other people haven't worked out either that there needs to be a change or they're not ready for it. So a few points just to highlight some of the themes that we've been touching on here from Marshall Gantz. Building relationships committed to a common purpose. Ben talked about that in his example. Translating values into sources of motivation. I think you can feel that again coming through in the story. How can you be authentic in what you're doing? Using assets, so the creating the lunch the way that Ben just described it, or changing the access, was using the resources that were available to create something, and using authority to be facilitative. Useful checklist in terms of what we've covered so far. is it enough? You may have seen Don Berwick's talk at the IHI International Forum in Europe this year, and he talked about our traditional approaches to improvement, of which obviously he's been a massive leader, and asked the question, is it enough? And his conclusion was it wasn't, because we're heading towards periods of really, really big change. And the slides and connections to the talk are at the bottom if you want to go into that. I want to pose the question to you: if we are into a period where we need really, really big change, what does that have to do with culture and how we go about organising? Well, the first thing is just to mention the 3 horizons that Bill Sharp and colleagues have developed. And their proposition is that every quarter of a millennia or so many things in the current way of doing things go out of kilter at the same time, that there is going to be a big change. Does that feel familiar to you? It does to me. And what's also true is that the 3rd horizon, there are parts of the future already present, just not evenly distributed, and so they become more and more important. And in the 2nd horizon, it's how you get from A to B. What's the bridge between where we are and where we're going to go? And you can see that as a rather scary thing, or you can see it as a significant opportunity. What's interesting, if you're in the scary negative mindset, when you see new ideas and you're in the running the current system, you'll say new idea, very risky, irrelevant. You'll see people trying to drive change as obstructive or impractical, and you'll see, if you've come up with the new ideas, that the people running the system are either dinosaurs or trying to wreck your rather good idea. Contrast to the positive perspective, and you'll see a different sort of model. So people running the system, how do you find new ideas? How do you generate hope? People with new ideas, how might we achieve scale and build allies? And people seeking to manage the change, how do you create support and inspiration? And in many conversations, you'll understand very quickly whether you're in a negative mindset or a positive mindset sort of space, and how you can build bridges between them. So just to build on that a little, if really big change is needed, if a positive mindset is needed, how do you create some hope? And what we see increasingly in the work we're doing is that forecasting approaches, just moving forward gently, limit the range of possibility. So how do you build in some foresight work, thinking about a range of possible ways forward, thinking about what would make a difference to the experience of care and the workforce experience, to give yourself a bigger ambition and a bigger range of what you could do in primary care. And that means thinking through the energy. I know you're going to talk more about psychological safety specifically in a future webinar. Just to say, it's one of 5 sets of energy, and traditionally in healthcare, if in doubt, we follow an intellectual route. 100-page document, not long enough, let's write 1,000 pages on the topic before we have a 10-page conclusion. Not very influential. We need to be thinking through the social and the spiritual, what brought us all into healthcare, and the physical, how do we build action in, and all of that, as Ben very nicely described in his example, rests on creating psychological safety. So as you're designing change processes, as you're thinking about culture, think about the balance. And what we see is when energy isn't being managed well, these things happen. So if you recognize this, think about what's the missing ingredient and think about how you can change the balance. I'm not going to dwell too much on Amy Edmondson because you're going to come back to this, but Ben told us quite a bit about this in terms of how do you get that individual agency, how do you deal with that loneliness of being on your own at times, particularly if you're in that chaos space of needing to act, not necessarily having the full mandate. How do you build that collective agency? And think about how you measure that and how you control it, not necessarily in a very scientific way, but yeah, how do you deal with these feelings? Because it's tough work, and the more you can get your team involved, the easier it is. A couple of words here on traditional program management and system convening. Everything that I've talked about is really in the space of complexity and emergence. It's very hard to write a project plan saying what you're going to do in 3 years' time. You might be able to drive some milestones, you might think through how to organize, yet good program management gets things done. So what we would advocate is balancing your program management with the convening piece, and not being afraid to change a project plan if it needs to evolve. Having a plan is much better than having no plan, but having a plan that's then rigidly project managed that stops that additional engagement that we talked about in the model of large scale change is a barrier. So again, think about both poles of that diagram. I'm going to whiz through a last few points, so we've got a few moments to address questions. I can see the chat is building up quite rapidly next to me. In Don's talk, he talked about Trojan mice, and that's because he'd been talking with Helen about Trojan mice beforehand. And the trick here in that sort of probing piece is how do you find out what may work? Ben described it in terms of different approaches to sorting out reception and the mealtime thing. Go forth and do some experiments. And Trojan mice are small, well-focused changes that you get a lot of feedback from. And rather than putting all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak, testing the options, being systematic, doing small things, going where you can create energy, not going where you can't, makes a lot of sense, and nicely summarized here. Couple of quick points in terms of setting up meetings and facilitating. When we set up conversations to do this kind of work, we always try and answer these 4 questions. What and why? If you're not clear about what and why, it's not likely that you'll get a good answer. And actually that takes time. The hardest part of designing a good event is actually working out what and why. The environment is really important, increasingly virtual. Getting the right people into the room, obviously really important, and thinking about the process. And that's a whole seminar in its own right. But again, there's a link to Matthew and Gail Taylor's work if you want to do things. And you'll find you run much better events if you follow a process. Just on scale, this is a fascinating piece of work. I met one of the authors of this work on a train once, and they've now got the Guinness World Record for the largest number of authors in a single paper. And they're now producing several papers a year in the Lancet and similar journals. I think the issue is, primary care is quite small, it's quite local, but what if you work together? Can you create a bigger impact? So if you need to make a really big change, and Don is right, what's the scale that you organize around to achieve that goal? I'm not going to answer that question for you. It's for you to answer, but how ambitious will you need to be to create primary care fit for the future that's ahead of us? Quick summary in terms of being a change agent, and look in particular at the thinking piece. I think a lot of what I've covered is in this right-hand side, thinking in interdependent ways, the need to hold multiple perspectives, the need to think short-term and long-term, and to be in that positive mindset are probably the key points. So key takeaways, we can all lead change. Culture emerges through action, and importantly, how the action is undertaken. So if you go down an old power route, you'll get a very different response to going down a new power route. Relationships and agency are key. We are in a period of significant uncertainty, so spending time making that collective sense of what matters here is critical. And be bold. Spend time on foresight, so you can be as ambitious as you need to be to move forward primary care. I'll stop at that point, Dale, and happy for you to highlight any questions that people would like us to address in a little bit more detail.
Great. Sasha and Ben, thank you for a masterclass in organizational culture and change management, and so many really important points. So we will take some questions now. Sasha, perhaps if you stop sharing, we can look at each other. I'll just flip it to one of our co-leads, Ivy Anderson, for the first question, and then I encourage people to put together some questions for Sasha and Ben.
Sasha and Ben, thanks so much. Inspirational to understand and highlight change is possible. The fact that you're working with the National Health Service in the UK, and that's your government form for making health reform, is also a sign for us in Canada that change is potentially possible. My question is related to trying to get our folks that are like the NHS to buy into this kind of change approach and change strategy, and how have you been able to nudge, convince governmental or bureaucratic folks that are dealing with reform that this kind of change leadership is this innovative change is what gets us there? Any thoughts on that?
The tricky question to kick off with. It's really difficult. I think the traditional government departments are beholders of the first horizon in that Bill Sharp model. Their job is to run the current system, and it's very hard when you're running the current system to take the time to move to this sort of different approach. So what you see is individual systems, individual projects being ambitious, and then that catching on. So we tend to work with the programs that are trying to be different, and that is slowly but surely nudging the work in different ways. So right now I'm working on how do we make the UK more active in terms of physical activity, and we're using a lot of the methods I've been talking about. And we've just published yesterday a major condition strategy, and some of that work is following through into the mainstream. So I think as people see that it makes a difference, we will get more traction, but it's not universal yet.
Thank you. People.
Just one thought on that, I guess. So I guess one is about data. We know when you actually produce results that mean something to those people, then that starts to put them curious, I think. And I think part of the answer to the question as well would be, I'm not sure how necessary it actually is to, because what we're talking about in terms of the large scale change stuff is people connecting, building community, building a sense that something else is possible. And it can often just be about people who've got energy and ideas and hope, connecting with each other, sharing ideas, making changes. And it's almost like that is the new power in a way. Is it almost kind of, to some extent, I mean, the old power can squash it, but really it's not so necessary to try and get old power to start doing new power. It's that the new power can get on with it, I think. That would be my hope anyway.
No, that's a very fair point, Ben.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, and I think your point is well taken about hiring for fit, and drawing out those leadership capacity, that leadership capacity that really struck me in your comments within your team that aren't just there because they've been there the longest. I believe that Ivy Bergeon has a question as it relates to psychological safety and some of the comments that you both made.
Yeah, thank you so much. And in addition to being a co-lead on this project, we're leading a team specifically looking at how do we create tools and processes to embed psychological health and safety, just understanding what that is. How do you go about doing it? And I really liked how you framed that in terms of our hierarchy. So if you were to say one or maybe two or three, key learnings around psychological health and safety from your experience, that would be wonderful for our team to hear.
I'll dig out a pamphlet we wrote, having done some work with Amy, that's on our website, and put it into chat before we finish, or I'll send it over. But I think the key is being really open, being really respectful, and Amy always says, the next important information can happen from anywhere. So if you close it down and say, well, I'm only going to listen to the current experts, you're going to miss really important things. And I think it's really hard to do, to create that time and that space. But examples like Ben's Lunchtime Club make a huge difference. You'll hear completely different information in that setting to what you'll hear in a formal board report or whatever. So change the setting, ask good questions, be respectful would probably be my three top ones. Ivy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sasha. I have a question for Ben. You talked about the resistance, and Sasha's talked about the resistance, and everybody, are you crazy? This will never work. What was the tipping point for you? I think everybody on this call in Team Primary Care is, we're climbing a mountain. What was the piece that just said, okay, I can do this, and I'm moving forward?
Yeah. So there's a quite a clear, clearish answer to that question. I've been asked that question before. It was when I really got to grips with understanding the things that could make a difference and really believed that it could work. And there was someone in reception who was going to be team leader, or she either was team leader or it looked like that was the way, the direction things was going. But things were still a real mess, and she was at the point of leaving. And I don't say these kind of things very often, but I said to her, I think I even said, I promise you that in a year's time, it will not be like this anymore, because I feel like I've grasped what needs to happen. It just isn't happening yet. So then I must have felt a real conviction to say, I mean, I really wanted to stay, of course, but and it was, and years later, it was totally. So it was just getting to grips with the fact that there were things that would make a difference. Yeah. And in terms of that psychological safety, I think it's a really, really good question about pragmatically, how do you do it? There's a kind of few quick thoughts. One is around having small groups, because if you're in one big group, 20 people, that's just not safe for people. So if you want people to go a bit deeper, going in small groups and then relaying thoughts back can be really helpful. You can do that virtually as well. Things like the kind of psychometric tests that you can do. And if you can kind of do it in a group in any way, people love to talk about who they are, what they're like, why they like this, why they're motivated like this. And people start to self-disclose. And I think that's more than the actual knowing what you're like, actually that discussion really enriches. And one of my favorite exercises we ever did, everyone brought in 3 objects that were meaningful to them. And we went around actually in a big group, and everyone said, this is what I brought and this is why it matters to me. And people talked about husbands that had died, things where they'd achieved things. It was just beautiful, tears. laughter, but actually recognizing that that is real work. Like that isn't just a bit of fun and it's nice, and that everyone else would have felt this was just a good experience. But I was like, that is probably one of the most important meetings we've ever had. And in recognizing that, modeling vulnerability, modeling weaknesses, the leaders doing that, and celebrating when people are open about things where things have gone wrong or their weaknesses, acknowledging that that's okay. Just a few thoughts.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sasha and Ben, for taking time out of your evening and moving into perhaps your mealtime. Thank you so much. I think that we will have this webinar recorded online, so because people will probably want to go back and watch it. There were so many pieces that we want to look at, and we will post the slides. But again, very, very helpful to Team Primary Care as we look forward and try to build our team now and look forward to the future and make that big change. Thanks so much.